welcome back. Now, ratings agency Moody's recently released a report saying that it foresees South Africa's gross domestic product, or GDP, shrinking by 6.5% in the current fiscal. Now, it also says that the 500 billion rand relief package announced by President Cyril Ramaphosa last week to combat the impact of the coronavirus will weaken public finances and limit funds available to state-owned entities. And joining us now to discuss this further is political analyst Khaya Sithole. Khaya, welcome.
Thank you and good morning to the viewers.
Khaya, first off, do you agree with the Moody's prediction?
Well, I mean, the thing about economic forecasts is that absolutely nobody's ever got it right. So essentially what you do is that you look at the trends in the output of the economy and then you try and work out what might happen within a particular time frame. But I think what no one is going to dispute is that obviously over the next 12 to 18 months, we do expect that all economies across the globe are going to be a bit smaller than they are today, than they were last year. And it's simply a question how small they're going to be. And Moody's saying that 6.5%, it sounds like indeed a huge number, but of course that's based on what their prediction on the trajectory of the South African economy and indeed the global economy is going to be over the next 12 to 18 months.
Now, let's talk to that package announced by the president last week, 500 billion rand, Khaya, and Moody's again saying that this rescue plan is likely to have negative consequences on public funds.
Well, I mean, that's the thing about fiscal packages of this nature, is that it really does try to put as much money into the hands of the citizens rather than the state. So it's not surprising that somebody would say that it does indeed have an adverse impact on public finances. The big question, of course, is the question of trade-offs. And when you talk about the trade-offs, the question you should be asking is, in the absence of such an intervention by the state, what would the situation look like? And of course, you have to consider that if you say you're not going to intervene, it means you are accepting or acknowledging that you're going to have a much smaller economic base going forward. But of course, this is, a vicious cycle, because if you have a smaller economic base going forward, it means that your tax revenues are going to be slower, and by default, public finances are going to be worse anyway. So it's always a question of how much you can put in and hope that it actually becomes or it generates a return much greater than what the sacrifice is that you have to make in the short term.
And speaking of taxes, some people still feel that more could be done on this front. What's your take on that, Khaya?
I think in relation to personal income taxes, the scope is completely gone, because personal income taxes, the highest rate is now at 45%. So it's very difficult to go beyond that, because you're now approaching 50% territory. And that is just considering just direct taxes that are levied by the state. There's also the question of indirect taxes that we really cannot quantify for any individual, because obviously it depends on what it is that you choose to buy or not to buy. But also in the South African context, a lot of people have highlighted that, not only do you pay these high taxes, but in fact, most of the services that you would expect to receive, having paid these high taxes, you actually cannot get them from the state. So you see that the same people that do pay these high taxes then end up having to pay additional costs to access the type of services that should be offered in the public service, but they end up having to source them from the private sector. You're looking at just how big the private security industry is, for example. That is an exhibit of the failure of the state rather than a success of the private sector. So it's very difficult to imagine that you can do it at that personal income tax level. So of course, the other alternative is always going to be corporate taxes. And remember, corporate taxes are a complicated issue, because they're not standalone taxes. And for far too many companies, being capitalist in nature, the moment you say that you're going to raise the taxes, their intention is to then maintain the same return that they had last year. So if the taxes are high this year, they're simply going to employ less people. So then it does become self-defeating in one way. So it's very difficult to know what is the absolutely optimum tax rate that a country should have. But in the current instance, you're unlikely to get it from personal income taxes for sure.
But looking at what you say, what would be the natural instinct for companies to do in terms of if taxes were raised to limit, the number of employees that they would employ if they were to employ, or rather cut down on their workforce? And you posted something yesterday, very interesting, in the New York Times that they were reporting on regarding job security. And we're going through, of course, as the rest of the world, very much the same thing in terms of people and, not being secure. And we are expecting many more people to lose their jobs at this time, Khaya.
Yeah, I think, I'm busy researching the concept of job fragility in the context of the U.S. workforce, because what we've seen in the United States over the past couple of months is, the numbers of people that are now applying for unemployment benefits is over 20 million. So the question that I'm now trying to interrogate is, 3 months ago, Donald Trump would have been going on about how, I've got the lowest unemployment on record and all of those good indicators. And to now see that within a matter of weeks, there are 20 million people that have now suddenly lost that ability to say I have a job means that those jobs were fragile to begin with. And I think obviously in the South African context, the situation is even worse in that there will be companies that really with the best intentions would like to hold on to as many people as they can. But of course, you are only in business for as long as you have a customer base that can sustain you because they are buying your products. And when the economy is not performing very well, you start losing out on your customer base. It becomes impractical to keep the same workforce even if you wanted to do so. Now, the question that we saw in the New York case study, for example, is how can you then incentivize businesses to keep people employed in spite of the fact that we know that the dynamics are changing? And in some cases, it's not easy and it's not practical. But also what we've seen in a country like the United States, for example, is that during the layoff, some people have been receiving unemployment benefits. Now, when you then go back to work, it turns out that your actual wage is lower than the unemployment benefits that you've been receiving. So now they're struggling with the question of how do you convince people that are in that unique situation to actually go back to work. And the reason the actual wage is lower than the unemployment benefits is because the actual wage is set on the basis of what it is that we can sell, how much we can sell it for. So therefore, this is how much we're going to compensate you for baking that loaf of bread or for doing whatever it is that you're doing at work. So it's a very interesting dynamic that we're seeing developing in the United States workforce.
Very interesting indeed, Khaya. And if you consider, the United States, one of the biggest economies in the world, and you look at our situation where we're nowhere near that, and we see what's currently happening as a result of COVID-19. You take the airlines, for example, SAA, SA Express, and the absolute bloodbath that is currently playing out there. You look at what's happening in the mines. Last week, you have Eskom, for example, trying to declare force majeure with Exaro, those sort of dynamics. So how do we come out of this, in any decent form?
Well, I suppose the South African problem is unique in that even before the coronavirus, you had these glaring problems within just the way our labor market is structured. I think a lot of people over the past couple of years have been opposing the idea of a minimum wage simply because they're saying that, in an employment contract, you are contracting with two, sober-minded individuals, so we should be able to determine the price of the transaction ourselves without government intervention. But of course, the issue in South Africa is that historically we've seen exhibits of exploitation where obviously what people do get paid doesn't really match the type of effort that they're putting in. So the South African minimum wage conversation is far more complex than other countries would probably talk about it. But now the question is coming back, which is to say, look, if even the people that are in a position to employ other people are now arguing that we can't afford to do it at that wage, what is the better alternative? Do you simply say, let me not employ a person, or do you then say, let us negotiate a wage that might turn out to be below the minimum wage standard? And I think it's going to be an ongoing conversation, particularly now that we are in this particular crisis. And I think obviously when the president spoke last week about a new economy, and I think also the finance minister spoke about this idea of a new economy, it is our duty as citizens to ensure that whatever that new economy looks like, it must prioritize the idea of mass employment, because I think in the South African conversation, until you deal with the fact that there's millions of people who quite simply do not have the ability to be employed within this prevailing economic architecture, we're going to have a big crisis looming. And I think this particular crisis is now actually forcing us to start thinking about what exactly it is that we're going to do in order to make sure that in the long run, we gravitate towards something that approaches some stable levels of employment. But right now, the unemployment crisis is way too high.
Speaking of the Finance Minister, Khaya, Tito Mboweni last week announcing approximately 800 billion rand to be injected into the economy in order to alleviate the impact of this COVID-19 pandemic on the economy. Do you think that government is on the right path in terms of dealing with the pandemic? And what is most likely to be affected here from this COVID-19 pandemic moving forward? How again, do we go about footing the bill for this?
Well, the question of whether we're on the right path is obviously in the affirmative, because we know that we've got a very conservative government, we've got very conservative fiscal policy, and we've got a very conservative monetary policy stance. So in the absence of this crisis, absolutely none of these interventions could have ever made it to even the first discussion point at any level in government. So now, because we're in a crisis, they are being forced to step out of their own comfort zones and say, these are the interventions that we need to make. Now it's a question of the scale and the depth of the interventions. Do we think 800 billion rand in the form of direct and indirect interventions is enough? Well, we have to evaluate it on the basis of what it achieves. And I think for a lot of citizens, we're still struggling to identify what exactly are the 3 or 4 key points that the government has said, this is what we're going to prioritize in this particular crisis, and therefore we're going to redirect as many resources to those issues as possible. And I think if people were at least able to crystallize it to just a few key talking points, then we'll be able to know this is what we're trying to achieve and what is going to be the impact on the bigger economy. And I think also we do have to deal with the fact that that 800 billion rand number is problematic in the sense that it doesn't mean that suddenly there's 800 billion rand sitting in a bank account somewhere that didn't exist yesterday. 800 billion rand rather is really the sum or the cumulative impact of the multiple interventions that the state has said we're going to put into place. So for example, if they say, look, we're going to have a loan guarantee scheme of 200 billion rand, there is no 200 billion rand anyway. It's potential liabilities that the state might have if I go and borrow and the bank says, I don't trust you, but I'm only going to lend to you because the government has said they'll bail you out if you aren't able to honor your loan. So that 200 billion rand might never materialize if all of us who do go and borrow with that guarantee as background never actually default. So when you do talk about this 800 billion rand, it may just give the wrong impression that there's 800 billion rand in hard currency that exists today that didn't exist yesterday, but it's far more complicated than that.
Khaya, just to pick up on something that you mentioned there in terms of just simplifying it all, you know, as you say, prioritize 3 key points. And we have a history of doing this as South Africa. You know, when we talk about plans, we talk about a 9-point plan, a 14-point plan, and we never seem to keep up or know exactly what is going on. Why do we seem incapable of keeping things simple?
I think we are capable of doing it. We just prefer not to do it. And because this type of conversation is not new, the former Stats SA head in particular was always very clear about the fact that, long-range planning requires you to anchor a few critical points of this economy that you decide that this is what want to be able to focus on. And of course, you identify those on the basis that they've got the capacity to achieve the greatest social impact, however you decide to measure that. So if we decide that our goal as a country is to have a particular employment rate, what do we need to put in place in order to get us there? And everything else might then become a byproduct of us achieving those higher employment rates compared to the unemployment crisis that we have here, for example. Maybe we could decide that, the cost of doing business is going to be our focus area. So we go and evaluate the compliance burden that small businesses have in particular, and then we say, how do we deal with this? And we've seen evidence of this now, that people are being told that they can apply for funding, and now they're being rejected on the basis that their documentation is not in order. So a lot of them that you ask, well, why aren't you compliant with this and that? And then they're saying, well, the cost of being compliant is simply too excessive, and I'm still trying to break even in the business. So it's clear that we do have particular issues there. Have we then decided that that's what we're going to fix? It's just a bit unclear at this stage.
And perhaps just to round it all up, Khaya, you spoke about how our employment crisis was already one that was one of the worst in the world going into this particular pandemic. And now this is all happening, this pandemic, against the background of 4IR as well, the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And there is an expectation that there will be more automation post this COVID-19 pandemic. What is in store for us as a nation?
Well, of course, the labor market are going to be significantly affected by the question of automation. And I think we cannot be blind to the reality that there's going to be a lot of casualties. And unfortunately, when we do speak of casualties here, we're not speaking about just the person who currently has a job, but the entire family unit or even the community that depends on that person's ability to maintain a job. So the big problem that we need to be able to deal with is how do we transition ourselves into that really evolving world of work. And so far, it's been very difficult to identify the government's blueprint for saying this is how a particular sector is going to be affected by this. So therefore, this is how we're changing the way people transition into the workplace, whether it's through educational means or vocational means. It's really difficult to find out exactly what our master plan is. And I think, obviously, if you go back to what we've done before when we drew up the National Development Plan, at least you could see that the capacity to plan and think ahead does exist. The fact that we're going to miss absolutely every single target of the National Development Plan then speaks to the execution risk that is prevalent within a state as ours. And I think until we deal with the execution and implementation risk, you may find that actually it doesn't make a difference whether we have a blueprint or not, because it will never get implemented. So we need to go back and find out exactly how it is that we're going to really transition our way as a country into this new and evolving world of work with the casualties that we already know are going to materialize, because that's how the world of work is evolving. So I do think that we need to take a step back and say this is it and this is how we're proceeding with it. But we have far too many think tanks, we have far too many workshops, and years later we're still trying to debate about what ought to happen when other countries have already moved to adoption mode.
Well, thanks so much for speaking to us this morning, economic and political analyst Khaya Sithole there, and talking to us about the ratings agency Moody's predictions that South Africa's GDP will shrink by 6.5% in 2020 and other matters around the COVID-19 pandemic as well. It is now 5 minutes before 8.